Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the epic story of the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad, by Gordon H. Chang. Read by David Shih. Introduction. Hung Hua stepped up into the private train car of James Strobridge, the field construction boss of the Central Pacific Railroad Company, CPRR. The wagon's well-appointed interior must have seemed a dark, cool oasis for the seasoned Chinese worker, offering a bit of welcome relief from both the blistering afternoon heat in the Utah desert and the bleak, monotonous scenery. Hung Hua and Strobridge had come to know each other well over the previous 5 years during the construction of the Pacific Railway, or the Transcontinental Railroad, as it was popularly known. Two competing railroad companies had led the project. The CPRR, which began its work in Sacramento, California, and built eastward, and the Union Pacific, UP, which started in Omaha, Nebraska, and built westward. Their completed work, linked to already established rail lines in the east, forged a continuous road of iron across the entire country, making possible travel unprecedented in scale and speed. Now the two men were coming together at Promontory Summit, Utah, where a grand celebration had just concluded to mark the formal end of work. The date, May 10, 1869, has been immortalized by one of the most famous photographs of 19th century America. Two massive steam engines, representing the CPRR and UP, meet head-to-head in East and West Shaking Hands. The photographer, Andrew J. Russell, wanted to highlight the train's bonding of vast geographic space. Others at the time saw the rail connection as transformative, not just for the nation, but for civilization itself. Only Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World, an energetic observer declared, surpassed the completion of the rail line in historic importance. After the camera shots and public events, Strobridge gathered journalists, military officers, and other notables to mark the occasion in a quieter way over drinks and food in his personal railroad car. In what must have seemed a magnanimous gesture at the time, he invited Hung Hua, who brought several other Chinese with him, to share the special moment, representing the thousands of Chinese who had toiled for the CPRR and made possible what many had once claimed was an insurmountable construction challenge. Upwards of 20,000 Chinese, 90% of the CPRR construction labor force, had built almost the entire western half of the Pacific Railway. The UP relied largely on Irish and other European immigrants, and both black and white Civil War veterans for its labor force. While the CPRR's leg of the railway ran to a little over half the length of the Union Pacific's portion, 690 miles compared to 1,086, building the western section posed a considerably greater challenge. The majority of the Union Pacific's line extended over relatively open, even countryside, beginning in Omaha, where the country's existing rail network ended. The CPRR, by contrast, faced a shorter but much more arduous journey. Beginning in Sacramento, roughly at sea level, it ascended almost immediately into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, climbing higher and higher until it reached elevations of over 7,000 feet. To reach those heights, the workers of the CPRR had to blast and dig their way through expanses of solid granite and brave some of the most dangerous working conditions imaginable. Chinese workers did what was widely considered at the time to be impossible. They endured scorching summer heat in the high altitudes, dirt and choking dust, smoke, and fumes from the constant use of explosives. They survived isolation, desiccating winds and thin air, winter blizzards and freezing temperatures, as well as the ever-present dangers of accidental explosions, falling trees, snowslides, avalanches, cave-ins, illness, broken limbs, and plain exhaustion. All to realize the federal government's great ambition of uniting the American continent with a central artery. These workers, in no short order, helped solidify the westward future of the United States. As a reflection of this Herculean feat, the engravings on the legendary and ceremonial Golden Spike that symbolically united the rails of the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads, hailed the Transcontinental for bridging the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, reducing to 1 week what had been a perilous 3 to 6 month journey, and healing the wounded nation. The Civil War had ended 4 years earlier, practically to the day, leaving a trail of destruction and a fractured union in its wake. "May God continue the unity of our country," read the engraving on one side of the golden spike, "as this railroad unites the 2 great oceans of the world." The Chinese had played a heroic and indispensable role in this achievement, and Strobridge, who had played a leading role of his own in the project, now honored them for their enormous contribution. Strobridge had come far, not just in distance from Sacramento, where the CPRR's work began, but in his attitudes as well. 5 years earlier, he had strenuously opposed the proposal to hire Chinese workers. He argued with his boss, Charles Crocker, one of the so-called Big Four, along with Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins, who served as directors of the CPRR, that the Chinese were not fit physically or temperamentally for the demanding work. Strobridge eventually relented, and Chinese, a few at first, and then by the thousands, joined the construction effort, proving themselves not just entirely capable, but vital. In time, they caused Strobridge to correct his error and drop his prejudice. Hung Hua, for his part, had begun working for the CPRR in January 1864, after traveling to America from thousands of miles away in southern China. At Promontory, he was in his mid-30s, slightly older than most of the other Chinese, who were in their teens and 20s during construction, prime working ages for physical labor. He had received some education before coming to the United States and had a head for business, not to mention ambition. Before Chinese were hired onto the CPRR, he was a prominent figure in Auburn, a town in the heart of the California gold country in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Agents of the CPRR turned to him to recruit workers, and he eventually became the leading Chinese headman over hundreds and possibly thousands of his compatriots working for the railroad. He handled their pay, living arrangements, and relations with the company. He had also survived years of personal difficulty and dangerous work, all the way through to the end. Strobridge's invitation to Hung Hua at Promontory suggests they had developed a mutually respectful relationship, but it had not been easily forged. Strobridge was a demanding and intimidating supervisor who had earned a reputation for being especially tough on Chinese. He was as ferocious in appearance as in temperament. An errant explosion early in the construction effort had taken out one of his eyes, and an ominous black eye patch now covered an ugly scar. The Chinese railroad workers, in their lingo, called him one-eyed bossy man. Now, Hung Hua and several other Chinese workers, possibly Ging Cui, Wang Fuk, and Li Shao, who had been part of the crew that had laid the last ties and length of track earlier in the day, found themselves not only inside Strobridge's personal car, but also, probably for the first time in their lives, in close proximity to important white men. Perhaps Strobridge hoped that including the Chinese in his private event would make up for their absence in the public activities. Chinese had not been invited to attend the official proceedings, pose for Russell's historic photograph, or join the elite reception in the train car of Leland Stanford, the CPRR president. The Chinese were weathered workmen. They were slight of build, sinewy after laboring for years clearing the land, cutting through dense stands of forest, putting down the roadbed, shoveling snow, blasting tunnels through granite, and laying track over the Sierra Nevada mountains in winter and across the vast deserts and plateaus of Nevada and Utah in the summer. They were dark brown in complexion, their skin leathered from living and working in recent months under the relentless desert sun. Their clothes, if they had not been able to change after work, would have been tattered, patched, and threadbare. We can see their shabby attire in other photos taken earlier that day. Their cotton tunics and baggy pants were blousy and designed for demanding physical labor in oven-like heat. Heavy American-made leather boots protected their feet. They wore soft, wide-brimmed cotton hats, not the woven palm headgear from China they used elsewhere in other work. They dressed uniformly, like soldiers in an army. Strobridge introduced Hunghua and his co-workers to his other guests and brought Hunghua to the head of the dining table. Standing, Strobridge warmly praised the contributions of the Chinese and expressed his appreciation for the essential role they had played in the project. The assembled all then also stood and gave 3 rousing cheers to the workers. No doubt the first time that these Chinese laborers had been toasted by a crowd of white people. This moment was a symbolic high point in acknowledging and honoring their contribution to completing the rail line. The news article about the gathering nicely captured its significance for the Chinese, who were so often publicly disrespected, when it offered simply in a heading, "Chinese laborers at table." On no other occasion had the Chinese railroad workers personally received as sincere and spirited an appreciation of their long, dangerous toil. The journalist who recorded the event does not mention whether Hunghua responded to Strobridge's compliments or uttered any remarks at all. We do not know if he spoke. The news report rendered him mute, emblematic of the way Chinese in America were commonly presented then. Chinese railroad workers were acknowledged as ubiquitous and indispensable, but they were accorded no voice, literally or figuratively. We cannot hear what they said, thought, or felt. They were silent spikes or nameless builders, evocative terms recently coined by scholars seeking to recover the experiences and identities of those Chinese who built the Transcontinental. As with the news reports of the day, written history in the years afterward gives no voice or identity to the many thousands of these workers. In all of the many pages of serious writing about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, authors might describe the enormous efforts of the Chinese. They name but a few, however, let alone tell us something about them as living beings. The identities of Chinese in 19th century America were elusive, and trying to recover them poses daunting challenges. The absence of documentation, mainstream unfamiliarity with Chinese life in America, and deprecation of their presence in the history of the country have rendered these workers all but invisible. While the dearth of extant documentation from the Chinese workers can explain their shadowy presence in written history to a certain degree, prejudice through the years has relegated them to the margins of American life and memory in a more elemental way. Chinese were not deemed sufficiently important or interesting to include in sweeping narratives about the rise of the nation. In fact, in some instances, Chinese are written out of the story altogether. At the 1969 centennial commemoration of the events at Promontory Summit, for example, Secretary of the Interior, John Volpe, extolled the Transcontinental as a monumental construction achievement of epic importance to the country. Only the vigor of Americans made it possible, he boasted. Who else but Americans could drill tunnels in mountains 30 feet deep in snow? Nowhere did he mention the Chinese, prohibited from becoming citizens by federal law, and assuredly not embraced by his myopic vision of America. Nationalist celebration made no room for the alien Chinese, no matter how pivotal their role in the history of the nation itself. Ghosts of Gold Mountain is the first book to attempt to fully address the inadequacy, amnesia, and insults that for a century and a half have relegated Chinese workers to the margins of history. It seeks to present a full account of the thousands who worked on the Transcontinental and their story as lived experience. The Chinese are presented not as voiceless objects of interest or as docile human tools, but as vital, living, and feeling human beings who made history. They were laborers, foremen, contractors, masons, cooks, medical practitioners, carpenters, interpreters, and teamsters. Thousands more Chinese associated with them as friends and relatives, as part of the immense supply chain that provisioned them for years, and, away from the track in their off time, as gamblers, opium smokers, prostitutes, and devout worshippers of the gods and spirits who watched over them in their perilous work. Collectively, they were the railroad Chinese, a wonderfully evocative term coined by Lily, an immigrant from China whose great-grandfather worked on the Transcontinental, that captures their unique ethnic and class identity. For 5 years, from 1864 to 1869, Chinese constituted by far the largest single workforce in American industry to that date, not surpassed in numbers until the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. Their massed presence along the construction route astonished journalists and travelers who witnessed them living and toiling under the most difficult of conditions. Writers described encampments of hundreds of tents, massed armies of workers, and thundering explosions of black powder and dynamite that recalled the cannon blasts of the Civil War. The Reverend John Todd, who delivered the benediction at the promontory event, honored the central importance of the railroad Chinese when he declared, "The road could never have been built without the Chinamen." The road, in turn, transformed America. The Transcontinental meant that travel across the country was dramatically reduced in time, expense, danger, and discomfort. Regional agricultural bounty gained access to the entire national market and to the great ports of the eastern seaboard and San Francisco on the Pacific. Exploitation of the immense coal, iron ore, timber, and other natural resources of the Rocky Mountain region became possible. The United States became the only advanced capitalist country in the world that enjoyed year-round direct access to both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Regional rail projects boomed post-promontory, creating an even more efficient transportation infrastructure. Politically, the iron rails bound the United States as never before, while socially, the railroad made the far west accessible to populations from the east, and in turn, the Midwest and East now lay easily within reach for those from California, including Chinese. All this came at great cost, however, especially the native peoples. The railroad invasion furthered the violent suppression of their autonomy and ways of life. Despite their critical role in American history, the railroad Chinese remain silent spikes to this day. No text generated by any Chinese railroad worker on the Transcontinental Line in Chinese or English has ever been found, whether in the United States, China, or elsewhere. This is not because the railroad Chinese were illiterate. A remarkable number, like Hunghua himself, did read and write in their own language, an ability that many observers at the time noted. Many, including Hunghua, also spoke some English. They were far from being meek and quiet, moreover. They could be a garrulous and disputatious lot, and they remained faithful and connected to family and village in China. Tens of thousands of letters traveled back and forth across the Pacific in the mid to late 19th century. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company, the main American carrier in the Pacific, reported that in the single year 1876 alone, its ships carried more than 250,000 letters between China, Japan, and the United States. Yet remarkably, not a single message from or to a railroad Chinese in this vigorous traffic has been located despite the most strenuous research efforts. Today, there is nothing extant in their own words about their experiences. What happened to these many words written long ago? Arson, pillaging, and the willful destruction of Chinese belongings by hostile 19th century mobs in America help explain the absence of an archive, as do losses during these immigrants' many forced moves, ruin from earthquakes and fires such as at San Francisco in 1906, and the cruel devastation wrought by the many wars, civil upheavals, and revolutions in their land of ancestry. The habitual belittlement of their lives, and thus their archive, also deprived us of much of their record. Few, except perhaps their descendants and the exceptionally curious, wanted to know about the lives of Chinese laborers in America during the decades that have elapsed between their time and ours. This presents a formidable challenge to the historian today. How does one give voice to the voiceless? How does one recover a sense of lived experience if there is nothing from the central actors themselves? As a Chinese American, I had wanted to know about the Chinese builders of the Transcontinental ever since I was a youngster, but it was not until recently that I had the opportunity to engage in a sustained effort to recover their history. An international research project at Stanford that I helped establish and then co-direct took up these challenges, and for more than 6 years, conducted the most thorough study to date of the experience of Chinese road workers in North America. Scholars in North America and Asia, and from disciplines ranging from history and American studies to archaeology, anthropology, and cultural studies, scoured archives, family collections and memorabilia, government records, business papers, and archaeological reports in English, Chinese, and other languages to locate as much relevant material as possible. We also conducted oral histories with living descendants of railroad workers to learn about memory within families. This book draws significantly from the tremendous efforts of scores of scholars, students, and researchers around the world. Though difficult, a recovery of a lost past is possible if imaginative efforts are made to understand the rich and expansive historical materials that do exist. 19th century writers wrote extensively about the Chinese, and their observations can be read in ways that move the railroad Chinese from being objects for journalistic observation into the active center of the story. Years of dedicated research have also revealed substantial new documentation and sources in archives and libraries. Some of this rich material had simply been ignored as insignificant or bypassed as too challenging to use. Previous writers interested in the railroad had little or no familiarity with the history of Chinese American life and the wide array of sources from other dimensions of Chinese history in America that could be used to understand the railroad experience. There is Chinese language material here and in China that was never consulted in any previous railroad book published in the United States. For example, poetry and folk songs express hopes, dreams, fears, and tragedy, and offer insight into emotions and feelings. Railroad Chinese closely associated with other Chinese in California who wrote about their own lives, and this material provides further texture and context. Stories about the trials and tribulations of railroad workers circulated widely among the Chinese, and the repeated telling within families and community have come down through the years to us today. There is extensive business documentation, including payroll records and private correspondence and notes among the railroad magnates. From these, we learn names, job categories, pay rates, labor organization, and the relationship of railroad Chinese with the CPRR. We learn about working conditions and developments as the line pushed forward. Furthermore, in recent years, professional archaeologists have gathered an enormous amount of material, culture left behind by the workers, which provides fascinating insight into their quotidian lives and the larger networks of their existence that connected them to their home villages and Chinese settlements throughout America. Being attentive to the physical world of the railroad Chinese, geographic location, terrain, weather conditions, and the natural and built environment, helps to capture a plausible sense of what the railroad Chinese saw, felt, and experienced. While building the Central Pacific Railroad, they toiled outdoors, moving from the lush Central Valley of California through the forests and canyons of gold country in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, up into the high country of the indomitable Granite Mountains, and then into the high deserts that seemed to stretch toward eternity in Nevada and Utah. Though long separated from them by the passages of time, we can recover a bit of what they encountered in the rural towns and wilds of California, and what they felt out in the open during frigid winters and broiling summers, if we make the effort and use our empathetic imaginations. The variety of historical materials that we do have, pieced together and used in creative ways, helps us to reconstruct the story of the railroad Chinese. Above all else, though, appreciating their elusive history begins with our placing ourselves in their position, at the very center of the telling, and trying to see the world from their points of view. Only by doing so can we begin to fully respect and honor their profound humanity. This effort to recover their history begins with the origins of the railroad Chinese in distant rural villages located in the Pearl River Delta near Guangzhou, Canton, in southern China. They were Cantonese, a term commonly used to refer to an array of different regional and ethnic groups in southern China, who engaged in one of the great diasporas in human history. Numbering in the millions, they traveled across vast oceans to destinations in South America, the Caribbean, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and North America, where, beginning in the early 1850s, one stream of this great migration became miners, farmers, fishermen, merchants, and railroad workers throughout California, or Gold Mountain as they called it, and the entire American West. The story then moves to the early experiences of the Chinese in California and to their lives and labor during the years they worked for the CPRR. This forms the core of the book. From the booming port city of San Francisco, where the vast majority of the railroad Chinese disembarked, we will follow them across California's Central Valley to Sacramento, where the first tracks of the Central Pacific were laid, and then to Auburn, nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, where Chinese began to work for the railroad company en masse. Their numbers grew steadily as the line pushed farther east, deeper and higher into the Sierra. By the literal and figurative climax of the CPRR's journey over the Sierra, the completion of the Summit Tunnel near Lake Donner and Lake Tahoe, the Chinese formed roughly 90% of the company's workforce. It is no exaggeration to say that the effort could not have been completed without them. They labored and died among the peaks of the Sierra in some of the most extreme conditions imaginable, and when the work there was done, they continued eastward into the tumbling hills of Nevada and the flat, baking expanse of Utah. By the time the CPRR united with the UP at Promontory Summit, hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of Chinese had died over the 5 years of the construction effort. Their industry, sacrifice, and contribution attracted great national attention, and for a moment, it appeared that Chinese might be allowed to establish their place in the American family. Through the rest of the 19th century, thousands of railroad Chinese dispersed throughout the United States and Canada, including for work on scores of other railroad construction projects. They began to settle in large cities and small towns throughout the United States. The moment of possibility for them, however, was short-lived. The Chinese came to be seen as racial inferiors and competitors for work. Terrible violence and expulsion from America would be the bitter reward for their labor. Thousands were driven out of the country and went elsewhere in the world for work and survival. Many returned to their homes in what became known as railroad villages because of their connection to the work of railroad construction. Those who stayed here helped establish the foundation for what we now call Chinese America. They built communities wherever the railroad could take them, opening the way for their compatriots who followed them across the country. Descendants of the railroad Chinese were found everywhere, here and around the world today. Who were the railroad Chinese? What did they do on the Transcontinental line? What were their ways of work and life? Ghosts of Gold Mountain speaks to these basic questions, as well as to more specific questions that have long intrigued those interested in the railroad Chinese. How many toiled on the line? What kinds of work did they do? Did they actually suspend themselves in woven reed baskets down sheer cliffs to blast open the roadbed around mountains? What did it take to tunnel through the Sierra Nevada? What about the legendary strike of 1867, when 3,000 Chinese put down their tools and confronted the railroad barons? Why did they strike, and what was the result of their collective action? How many railroad Chinese died? Several score? Hundreds? Thousands? How did America treat them after the rail line was completed? What is their place and legacy in the sweep of American history? Central to this examination is the role of chance in the lives of the railroad Chinese. Their lives were replete with choice, circumstance, accident, and luck, both good and bad. They may have believed in fate, as humans are wont to do, but their lives were filled with the unknown, including high risk to life and limb. They went out from their homes in South China seeking a livelihood and even good fortune, but they also knew that life was precarious. Tragedy, injury, and violent death in the 19th century Pacific and Western United States were commonplace. Disease and mistreatment on the high seas in transit took many lives, as did villains in California who despised Chinese and targeted them for plunder and sport. Avalanches and snowslides swept countless Chinese down.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?